In the years following the American Civil War, freedom existed mostly on paper. For black families across the South, the war had ended, but the violence had not. White sheets replaced uniforms. Night rides replaced battlefields. And justice, when it existed at all, belonged to those who already held power. The Ku Klux Klan was not a secret society hiding in shadows. It was an organized force, tolerated by sheriffs, protected by judges, and excused by politicians. Its purpose was clear: terrorize black communities into submission and erase the idea that the war had changed anything. In one rural region, far from newspapers and federal attention, a black family became a target not because they had committed a crime, but because they represented stability. They owned land. They lived without permission, and they refused to disappear. The attack came at night, as it almost always did. Witnesses later spoke of torches moving through fields and the sound of horses slowing near the house. There were no warnings. No arrests followed. By morning, an entire family was gone, and the message was unmistakable. The Klan expected silence. They always did. Silence had protected them before. But this time they misjudged who was watching. Miles away, men who had once worn Union blue began to hear fragments of the story. Not rumors, confirmations. These were black Union veterans, men who had survived battlefields where death was open and honest, not hidden behind masks. They had fought for a country that now pretended not to see them. What separated these men from others was not rage, it was discipline. They understood command structures. They understood coordination. And most importantly, they understood that fear worked both ways. The murder of that family was not seen as an isolated act. To the veterans, it was a declaration. The Klan believed they could act without consequence because they assumed black resistance no longer existed. They were wrong. Quiet meetings began to take place. No speeches. No public calls to action. Men arrived individually, not in groups. Old uniforms stayed hidden, but experience did not fade. Each veteran understood the risk, not only to himself, but to everyone connected to him. This was not about revenge. It was about drawing a line. For years, the Klan had operated under the assumption that black communities would absorb violence and move on. That assumption had allowed terror to spread unchecked. But soldiers think differently. They understand that unchecked aggression only grows stronger. And so, without announcements or headlines, a response began to form, measured, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. By the time the Klan realized they were being watched, the balance had already shifted. The men who gathered were not young rebels looking for a fight. They were veterans older, quieter, and far more dangerous to underestimate. Each of them had already faced organized violence and survived it. They knew how fear worked, how rumors spread, and how quickly authority collapsed when confronted by discipline. What made their response unusual was its restraint. There were no public threats, no dramatic confrontations, no crowds. Instead, information moved carefully from one trusted person to another. Routes were mapped. Meeting points were chosen for distance, not convenience. Every decision reflected training that had never truly left them. The Klan, meanwhile, continued, as it always had, confident in its invisibility. Local law enforcement showed no interest in the murdered family. Reports were delayed. Witnesses were discouraged. The silence signaled approval. That silence was precisely what convinced the veterans that the law would not intervene. They did not see themselves as vigilantes. They saw themselves as a final barrier, one that existed only because every official barrier had failed. To them, the Klan's attack was not just racial violence. It was an attempt to reassert control through terror. And terror only works when it remains unchallenged. Over several days, veterans arrived quietly from different counties. Some came on foot, others by horse. They did not travel together. They did not announce their purpose. But they all arrived with the same understanding. This time the Klan would not operate unseen. What formed was not a mob, but a perimeter. The veterans positioned themselves strategically, not around a town but around movement. They observed known routes used by night riders. They watched supply lines. They noted who suddenly avoided certain roads. The effect was immediate. Klan patrols began missing meetings. Night rides shortened. Masks appeared less frequently. Fear, once one-sided, began to reverse direction. No shots were fired. No speeches were made. But something far more powerful occurred. The illusion of dominance fractured. The Klan had relied on the belief that black resistance no longer existed. Now, that belief was visibly false. And once fear changes direction, it rarely returns to its original owner. The shift was subtle at first, but undeniable. Towns that once tolerated night riders began to notice absence. Meetings that were never advertised suddenly stopped happening. The veterans had not confronted the Klan directly, but they had disrupted its confidence. Confidence was the Klan's real weapon. Violence was only the method. Without certainty, their structure weakened. Members no longer knew who was watching, or who might follow them home. The veterans understood something the Klan did not. Fear does not require violence to function. It only requires the possibility of consequence. Word spread quietly, not through newspapers, but through warnings. Farmers advised sons to stay home at night. Riders chose longer routes. Men who once relied on anonymity suddenly questioned it. For the first time, the Klan was being observed by people who understood tactical patience. Local authorities noticed the change but misread it. They assumed the Klan had achieved its objective. That terror had succeeded. That resistance had finally collapsed. In reality, the opposite was happening. The veterans never sought attention because attention would have invited intervention, and intervention historically favored the Klan. So they remained invisible, disciplined, and precise. This restraint confused their opponents. There was no enemy to provoke, no group to arrest, no leader to threaten. The Klan had been trained to respond to chaos, not control. As weeks passed, the consequences became clear. Recruitment slowed. Attendance dropped. Some members abandoned the organization entirely not out of morality, but fear. The murdered family was never avenged publicly. There were no trials, no justice delivered by courts. But something else occurred, something the Klan had never anticipated. They lost the ability to act freely. And for an organization built on intimidation, that loss was devastating. The veterans did not celebrate. They did not claim victory. They simply maintained pressure long enough for the threat to collapse under its own weight. When the perimeter finally dissolved, it did so quietly, just as it had formed. But the message remained. There were limits, and for once, those limits had been enforced. What happened next was not recorded in official documents. No reports were filed. No statements were taken. History often pretends events like this simply faded away. But silence does not mean nothing happened. It means the wrong people controlled the records. The Klan did not dissolve overnight. Instead, it retreated. Its presence became fragmented, inconsistent, uncertain. Where it once acted with confidence, it now hesitated. And hesitation was fatal to an organization built on intimidation. Some members left quietly. Others denied involvement altogether. A few attempted to provoke a response, but none came. The veterans refused to be drawn into confrontation because confrontation created visibility. Visibility invited protection, and protection, in that era, never favored black communities. What mattered was not revenge. It was deterrence. By demonstrating discipline without spectacle, the veterans achieved something rare. They changed behavior without creating martyrs. No stories could be twisted. No false narratives could be printed. The Klan had relied on spectacle to survive burning crosses, night rides, public terror. Without those tools, it became weak. Local black families noticed the change immediately. Nightfall felt different. Travel felt safer. Not because violence had disappeared, but because unchecked violence had been interrupted. This moment did not spark a movement. It could not. The political climate would not allow it. But it did something just as important. It proved resistance had not vanished. For black Union veterans, this was not a victory to celebrate. It was a responsibility fulfilled. They had stepped in where institutions had failed and stepped back once the threat diminished. The family that was lost was never restored. That injustice remained permanent. But the message carried forward quietly, passed through generations in fragments. There were lines you could cross, and there were consequences even when history pretended otherwise. Years later, what remained of this moment existed mostly in fragments. A sentence here, a warning there, stories told carefully, often without names, because naming things made them vulnerable to erasure. Official history moved on quickly. Reconstruction faded. New laws appeared, but old power structures adapted. And once again, black resistance was minimized, reframed, or ignored entirely. The veterans returned to their lives quietly. Some moved away. Others stayed where they were, blending back into daily routines. They did not speak openly about what they had done, not out of shame, but caution. They understood how easily truth could be twisted. What survived instead was awareness, an understanding that organized terror was not invincible, that discipline could counter chaos, that fear could be redirected without violence becoming spectacle. This lesson was never written into textbooks. It did not serve the narrative of helplessness that history often assigned to black communities. Acknowledging it would have required admitting that resistance existed, even when it was inconvenient. The Klan continued to exist in different forms, but it never fully recovered its certainty in that region. Something fundamental had been damaged. not by force but by refusal. Refusal to disappear, refusal to panic, refusal to accept silence as submission. The family whose lives were taken became a symbol without a monument. Their names faded, but the reaction they triggered did not. It lived quietly in the way people remembered boundaries. Sometimes history is shaped not by battles, but by moments when violence fails to achieve its purpose. And sometimes the most powerful response is simply proving that fear no longer works the way it used to. What makes this story uncomfortable for official history is not the violence. It is the competence. The idea that black Union veterans, men trained by the same nation that later abandoned them, were capable of organized, disciplined resistance disrupts a familiar narrative. History often portrays black survival as passive endurance. But endurance is not the same as submission. And this moment proved that endurance could coexist with strategy. The veterans did not seek justice through institutions that had already failed them. They did not wait for protection that would never arrive. Instead, they relied on experience, restraint, and unity qualities learned in a war that promised freedom but delivered uncertainty. The Klan crossed a line because it assumed there would be no response. That assumption had protected it for years, but assumptions collapse when they meet preparation. No statues were built. No official acknowledgments followed. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence that follows awareness. The lesson was not about dominance or revenge. It was about limits. And for a brief moment, those limits were enforced by men history tried to forget. Today, this story survives not because it was recorded, but because it was remembered carefully, passed down without names, without dates, without proof acceptable to those who demanded silence. And perhaps that was intentional, because the most dangerous stories are not the ones that glorify violence, but the ones that prove it can fail.